down when you start working on a text?
So, right, whenever I start working with a biblical text for the purposes of preaching, the first question I ask, and I ask it every single time, is, and I think many in my congregation know this, what is God doing in or behind this text? So there are a lot of texts in which God does not appear as a character, like the entire book of Esther, right? But there are characters that stand in for God, or for God's, that represent God's purposes in the text. In a psalm like this, let me just ask you that question. Mm-hmm. As you look at this psalm, where is God in or behind? What is God doing in or behind this text?
You know what, I'm going to answer your question with a question first, because we ask different questions of the text as preachers. I start with, what does this text tell me about God? Mm-hmm. And sometimes God's the active voice. Mm-hmm. And sometimes God is alluded to, like the entire book of Esther, God is alluded to. And so that's my framework. And, this text tells me that God laments, that this is a shared common mutual language. If the psalmist can express this and it's directed to an audience, the audience must have the vocabulary to understand this communication. And so it implies to me that maybe two things. One, that the receiver of this message can hear it. That's a massive assumption, but I'm going to go ahead and assume.
Right. Because we're not in a place where we can't hear, right?
Right. And it also presumes that there's a dynamic and relationship between psalmist and hearer that was in some way affected or wounded.
Right. If I were to answer my own question about what is God doing in or behind this text, I would think hiding is too strong a word, but God is certainly withdrawing. It seems to the psalmist. So sometimes when I look at a text like this, I also ask and the reason why I ask the question the way that I do is because I'm always wanting to indicate the God who is active, right? That my basic assumption is that the presence of God is great, but it is cold comfort when there's a desperation for God to act. So I also look at what does this voice, what does the author believe that God has done or will do, right? And there's some good language about that as we get toward the end of the psalm also. So because the psalmist herself says, this God, I have seen this God in action, right? I have seen this God in action. I have experienced the action of God. And it is having had that experience that makes the God who seems remote or distant or disconnected from us, it makes it even more troubling and difficult. Right. Mandy, Sloan, McDow, welcome to Mary Esther United Methodist Church. I've been excited for this opportunity to chat with you and to allow our congregation to hear some different voices. I plan to do this on a fairly regular basis so that my congregation, because they hear my junk all the time, right? So I've been here a couple of years, and so they know a lot of my tricks, and so I want to expose them to some different voices. So thank you for being willing to come and share some time with us.
It's an honor. You and I have been friends for a long time, but you've been teaching me longer than you probably realize. And so anytime you want to talk to me, I'm honored to be a part of the conversation because I always wind up learning far more than I may contribute. So on behalf of me and my congregation, who are also really glad to have some additional voices preaching on Sunday.
Oh, that's right, because we're showing this both directions. Yes, we are. So that's great. Yes, and I'm delighted to be with First United Methodist Church in Los Angeles as well. So really quickly, I want you to tell our congregation, this will be boring. For those of you in Los Angeles, this is time for you to go get a coffee and sit down, because Mandy is going to wax on about you a little bit. But tell my folks a little bit about how your pastoral situation is unique.
It's unique, all right. Los Angeles First United Methodist Church was founded in 1853. So it is the oldest Protestant church in the city of Los Angeles. And because when you were founded that long ago, you have a wild, crazy history, usually involving multiple sites, multiple locations, and a lot of opportunities to do things either well or poorly. And it feels like along the way, my congregation that I am honored to serve always made some really courageous choices. The 1920s, this congregation managed to raise $1 million to build the largest building. In the 19 teens, they were doing this, which, given what we know now about the 19 teens and the sort of trauma of that season, I can appreciate even more how significant that was.
They did that even in the midst of a global pandemic, didn't they?
Right. Like, I have work to do. And they did it without the internet.
Right.
No. So bless them. It was a congregation that was empowered and strengthened and encouraged, and they wound up building this massive, beautiful building that was used for so much good. They started other ethnically or language-based congregations out of that space. They opened their space up to the MCC when it was first founding. They found ways to launch other ministries and missions out of their building with support, not just as a way to, share the space, but with intention and purpose. So I've always been really, really delighted every time I hear a piece of their history. But in the 1960s, as things happened, people moved out of the city and they moved to suburbs, and that building was not capable of being maintained anymore. So they made the courageous decision to sell it to the gas company. That all finally went through in the early 80s, and they got a nice chunk of change. They bought a piece of property that was near nothing, built, well, actually they didn't build anything. It was an office building. They converted the office building for the sake of their worship space, rented out some office space, did the best they could, and then within 20 years, that building itself was too much to maintain. And in the early 2000s, they tore it down. And they tore it down with hopes and plans and ideas and not enough money in the bank to make it all happen. And they didn't raise the money to build a new building. So that piece of land was paved into a surface parking lot that now happens to be a block away from the Staples Center in LA Live, which is the sort of industrial, what's the word I'm looking for? Entertainment hub of downtown.
Right.
So for the last 20 years, I'd say for the last 13 years, they've been able to monetize the lot and take in a pretty significant amount of revenue, which they used both for their own ministry purposes and to help fund and support other outreach work, the work of the Urban Foundation, the work of the United Methodist Museum for Social Justice, some really wonderful causes. And that was working for us really, really well up until March. So now we are back in the position of, what do we do with this land? Since I arrived, the church was on the verge of closing because it's a really complex situation. And it requires a lot of just unusual thinking about how to turn your biggest, what seems to be your biggest lack of asset into your greatest gift. And we moved our services outside. We meet under tents every Sunday. We are literally a church without walls. We were able to do that up until the pandemic started, and to be a church that's literally ministering to everybody in our area of downtown Los Angeles. So we see ourselves as houseless. We are in solidarity with our houseless neighbors, as well as our neighbors who are housed. And we are doing our best to figure out how we can convert our land into its highest and best purpose, which hopefully will answer some of the questions around housing and homelessness. So
that is really awesome. You know, I've you know, over the course of the couple of years that you've been there, it's just been so neat to see how so many different kinds of people, you know, wander into worship literally, to be with you. And I'm just, you know, I'm always inspired by your entrepreneurship and whatnot. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that part of your story. Mary Esther United Methodist Church was founded in 1965. And so we're a little bit behind you there. But we're in a community with we're sandwiched between two military bases. And in the 80s and 90s, because the church was new and had only been in existence for 15, 20, 25 years, a lot of new innovative ministries started out of that congregation, and the ministries that grew to the point that the congregation themselves could not maintain them, and so they would hand them off to other places, whether that's the Cold Night, you know, ministry with homeless people, or a backpack ministry, you know, feeding kids in the local elementary school, and sending them home with food for the weekend, etc. And eventually these things got started, birthed out of the church, and then handed off. So there's a history of innovative, interesting ministry into our community. And so we're still very connected with the community in terms of addiction recovery ministries, and you know, several other local thing, but the main thing that we do, of course, is we worship weekly in these spaces. We have a new space that has been developed, and that's a new burgeoning contemporary space. And so there's a lot of new things that are happening, and I've so enjoyed being here for the 2 years that I've been here. I guess we've you know, you were there a little before me. This is a desert song, Psalm 13. So as we take a look at the psalm together, it's the briefest of the psalms that we're looking at across these 4 weeks, but maybe it's the most impactful and the most difficult for us. So clearly the psalmist has encountered a crisis of some kind.
right.
And that crisis is now giving way to complaint, or what we would call lament. And, you know, I know that lamentation is not something that our culture seems very adept at. Why do you think that is? Why do you think lamentation is difficult for people? And what do we tend to do instead?
Such a good question. I mean, we live in a culture that I'd say too that we're living in a time where some of that is probably shifting. But, you know, one of the things I would see consistently, I have a daughter, and so I see the things that are marketed for girls in terms of clothing and apparel and attire. And, you know, the thing that they want to stamp on every t-shirt is good vibes only. And it annoys me because I do not espouse good vibes only. And I feel like it's the plea to say, I can't handle your truth. And if there's one thing that seems to be clear right now, it's that, at very least in America, America's telling the truth. Now, I'm not saying that the truth hadn't been told before. Of course it had. Of course it had. But now everyone's listening.
Yeah. And that's not, as we were saying a little bit earlier, that not everyone is in a place where they're prepared to hear, whether it's the lamentation of others, or even the need to raise their voice and say 4 times, like this psalmist does in 2 verses. How long, right? How long is this going to last? And I think it has been a crazy year. I mean, do you remember back when there were wildfires in Australia? Doesn't that seem like it was about 5 years ago?
Yes. Or like a book I read once when I was a kid. I mean, so serious, everyone very concerned. But that was like 31 years ago. I literally couldn't quantify how much time it's been.
And then, then suddenly we find ourselves thrust into a worldwide pandemic, which causes massive disruptions. We also see people of color suffer with that disease at more destructive rates than white people do. So, I've wondered to myself if some of that angst, and then of course it doesn't feed into this experience of seeing, in particular, these 3 murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and just the gut-wrenching lament, I think, that rises up from so many people of all hues, right, at seeing that, has forced us in some ways into a period of lament.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's true too, based on all the things that you just said, that some cultures do lament real well, really well. And so like gospel music is based in lament. And that is one of the reasons why I think we're turning to this right now, is because there's language borrowed from the Psalms, borrowed from Scripture, borrowed from Exodus, borrowed from the language of people who've been lamenting all this time. And, we talk about fragility. I love the idea that fragility can be described in 2 very different ways. One is that we just can't take it, and that's something that needs to.
It's just so hard. I can't watch that anymore today.
Yes. No, I mean, granted, we all have like our capacity to deal with hard things, but dealing with hard things is the first step. Ignoring them and pretending like they don't exist is a crisis of fragility that needs to be dealt with. And I think it's that sort of fragility prevents lament from being a common language. And most people don't have the benefit of fragility. People who have been oppressed do not have the benefit of fragility at all. So lament becomes the only language that we have to contend with what is true, and in some ways what is universal to the experience of being oppressed. And the worst thing is that if you're the oppressor, you have to contend with some really ugly things about yourself. I know I have. And that takes work.
What seems to be bugging the psalmist the most here, do you think, in these first 2 verses?
How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? I mean, that just touches right there on my own personal fear of abandonment. That's what I immediately think of, is an interpersonal relationship that has gone awry. Like that's the language of a breakup right there.
Yeah. It feels a little bit adolescent maybe to me, and maybe that's just me, but it's just like it's forever, right?
Yes.
Always, and how long is this just taking forever? But still, there are times and moments when we feel, I think, so disconnected from the God that we. In my preaching 2 weeks ago, I talked about Psalms of orientation, which are Psalms that reflect life when life is good, and you can just proclaim God as trustworthy and true and patient and present and high and lifted up, and just this soaring language about one's relationship with God. And when that feels like it's been disconnected, it's painful, right? It is painful.
Yeah. And the second verse about bearing pain in my soul, One of the things I really appreciate about the Psalms is that there is a variety of emotional experiences represented, even in the context of one psalm itself. And we'll move to that in a bit. But for what you're discussing about psalms of orientation, and this one clearly being a psalm of disorientation, how quickly it seems that move happens for the psalmist.
Yes.
And I think, if we're going into a question about like, well, what does this psalm tell me about God, or how is God moving in this particular psalm? Right now, it's very egocentric. This is 100% based on the experience of the psalmist trying to figure out where God's face is.
Yes. Yes. It's very close to the individual person who's praying. And pain does that. Pain brings us into our skin. And I know, for instance, in my congregation, there are, in particular, there are older adults, but we also have a big community of adults who are developmentally disabled, right? And church for them is a point, it is a place of connection and experience, direct experience of God in so many ways. And for them not to be able to, like, it is painful for them. Right, I have probably more phone calls from our community of special needs folks than anyone else. When are we going to when are we coming back? They feel it. You can tell they feel that disconnection in their own skin, and that is difficult. That is difficult. Right. So then in the next two verses of the Psalm, there is this move, as one of the commentaries that I was reading said, that, we've gone from crisis to complaint, but now the mood shifts a bit from complaint to plea, right? Just to like supplication, right? Where the psalmist says, answer me, God. Give light to my eyes, or I shall sleep the sleep of death. What do you think is going on there?
I mean, there's a definite tonal shift here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the point where the psalmist stops focusing internally. And again, to what you said earlier, pain is personal. And when anyone is in pain, whether it is physical, emotional, or spiritual, that pain limits our access to things outside of ourselves. So this is not a critique of what pain does, more than it is an awareness that it will bring us inward. And the whole world starts becoming about our own experience of how to contend with the pain. And this seems to be the shift. Verse 3 seems to be the shift where the psalmist finally turns outward. And even though the plea has been, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord, the demand for an answer, I think, is the invitation for God to participate in the conversation. And the thing I really love about this is something that I think we wrestle with. If we tend to be so fragile that we can't even lament, we can't even name hard emotions, I think one of the second flaws of the Christian role of trying to be faithful is the idea that we can't ask God hard questions.
And one of the great gifts of the entire book of Psalms is that, like I have said over and over in this series, that there is a psalm for every season of life. And there is no question left unasked, right? There is no stone left unturned in one's relationship, with God. And it is a gift for us to be able to witness here, ostensibly David, the king of, right, the king of Israel, a man at quote unquote after God's own heart, who then is able to, at the beginning of this psalm, shake their fist at the heavens and accuse, not only complain, but accuse God of deliberately ignoring him. But then to take that breath, I can hear the breath between verse 2 and verse 3.
Right?
where the psalmist is like, okay, all right, consider me, O Lord, and answer me, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm calming down a bit. We can have more, like, there's a possibility for two-way communication, right?
Yeah.
And I think, this feels so very human to me, because I think that in all kinds of relationships, what's happening right here has played out over and over. If I have, certainly not in this congregation, but I can say with a friend, right? There are some friends that there was a situation a couple of years ago where I had a very close friend of mine whose mom died,
Mm-hmm.
and I just wasn't as present as I should have been, because my life was being super complicated. I think I was in the process of moving here.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was some silence there in that relationship.
Yeah.
And then finally, when I picked up the phone and was like, hey, what's going on? That friend of mine could say, where have you been? I needed you at this point. You haven't been there. I need you to, there's some trust that is destroyed. And where are we? And, for me to say, I want to do what I can to rebuild the trust. And then for that person to say back to me, that's fine. It's going to take some time, But I think all of us at some point in time in relationships have, and so what the psalmist seems to do is to basically treat God more or less like anyone else, like any other relationship in their lives.
Yeah. I like to put this in the language of, we try to think about what can I tell God? Like I'm angry at God, but I'm not going to tell God that, because I don't want to make God angry at me.
Yeah.
And I think if God created the heavens, the earth, and all that is in it, God can take it. God can handle your anger. God can handle the injustice that you're experiencing. God can handle your lament. God can handle your whining. God can take it. God can take it. And the worst thing we can do is to stay silent, because that ends the communication.
Yes.
And right? So I love the idea that the psalmist is insisting now on dialogue. Like I've said my piece and counted to 10, and it's your turn, and I need answers. And I think time and time again, like Job is probably the best example of this, when God shows up at the last third of the book and says, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth, when I laid the foundation of the world? Where were you? Because I can tell you where you were.
Yeah.
I know where you were, and I was there all along. And you mentioned it in your dynamic, talking about what this means for trust.
Mm.
And I think you and I have addressed, what is the nature of lament? And the nature of lament comes from a relationship that matters.
Yes.
If it didn't matter, I wouldn't lament to somebody who doesn't know my story, who doesn't know me, who I don't trust with my feelings or my experiences. So this is a conversation that is predicated on trust.
What I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that to complain and to bring our whole selves before God is not an expression of our doubt in God's presence or action in our lives. It is the expression of trust and faith.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
But the psalmist doesn't stay there. The psalmist doesn't get stuck there, right? And I think some of us are worried, perhaps maybe, that if we let our anger go, that we won't be able to get back to a better place, that somehow it will be a faith-destroying activity. But I think just the opposite. I think it would be a faith-confirming activity to know that we have a God who is big enough to take it, whatever it is we need to, even if we find out later that we were dreadfully wrong.
Right.
You know, I still can imagine God, patting me on the back and saying, it's okay. I get it.
Yeah. And to have a God that can withstand the full range of human emotion means that God, and I think one of the reasons that we get afraid to a fist shake our, hands at the heavens is because God responds, and it's unpleasant sometimes.
Yeah.
But the piece that I think is really important for us, my congregation is currently doing disciple Bible study via Zoom, and it's been amazing. Probably a lot of us in the Methodist Church especially have done disciple Bible, but everything sounds different now. Everything.
Wow.
And it's been a really wonderful opportunity to dig back into the text and to start doing like a real character study of God. Because, isn't that what the task of faith is to both know God and love God and then be changed by that relationship. And so our fear is that God is so judgmental and so angry. But the thing that is 100% consistent is that it's never anger that upsets God. It's infidelity.
Oh, the language, the language that we hear frequently throughout the Bible is that I am a jealous God.
Yeah.
Right. I am a jealous God. That I think that is so wise and insightful that God can handle our anger. And I think God hears and cares about our anger and our difficult experiences and our experiences of being lonely or the absence of God. But I think God has a hard time, apparently, biblically, a hard time tolerating when we just easily, trollop off to worship something else,
Yeah. And, David is not immune to that,
Yep.
right? Like the things to which we build idols, David has already gone through, I think, at this point. I actually don't really know where this falls in the whole life cycle of David's story. Has the Bathsheba incident already happened?
Scholars don't really know. I think a couple of the scholars that I were reading believe, just based on the context, that this comes late in David's lifetime. So.
Which means that David's idolatry of Bathsheba and the subsequent events that transpire, the way in which he deals with Uriah, all of that means that David is not immune to his own capacity to build an idol and to turn away from God. And so what this tells me is that as much as God really doesn't like that, God consistently returns and consistently stays active in the relationship between us and God, even when we're bad at it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think during this time of the coronavirus and then also this other virus that is far more endemic to American culture, the virus of racism and white supremacy? What are we tempted to turn to as idols, do you think? What are the idols that tempt us away from a God who both seeks to minister, comfort, and care for us in our illnesses, but then also seeks justice for and equanimity for God's people? What are the things that we're likely to turn to as idols?
That's a really good question. The first thing that came to mind is tradition.
Say more about that.
I'm thinking about the things that are buffering the conversation, that especially as white people in white spaces, and I'll echo your comments earlier. I moved from Knoxville, Tennessee, which is not a particularly diverse area, to Atlanta in 1996. That's when I went to college, and it was then that I saw for the very first time, and my family's from West Tennessee. So West Tennessee, my dad lives in Memphis. It's a very tense racial environment. There's plenty more I could say about that. But when I moved to Atlanta, I saw with my own two eyes the fact that everybody in any kind of service position was Black. And I'd known for a long time, I was aware of the absolute distinction between the white experience and the Black experience, but had no sense of my own capacity to do anything about it. And frankly, it's a helpless feeling because, you know, one of the things I've had to be clear about with myself and my very white children is that, like, we are born privileged. We are born racist. We have to do this very systemic, internal, eye-opening, painful work to dismantle the structures of racism that we have so easily built into the fabric of our lives. And it could take everything down.
So, you know, to one of the things that I had to, when that word was first applied to me, racist, and when I began to try to apply it to myself and felt that pushback, what the origin of that was that I know what a racist looks like, right? A racist is not, you know, a racist probably has a jacked up monster truck and a gun rack in the back and, you know, has, you know, and is a horrible, bigoted, terrible person, right? That being racist means being bad.
Yeah.
That racists can't be good people, right? And I had to embrace for myself that it's not about my badness or my goodness, it's about my blindness or my sightedness. Okay.
Yeah.
So we can still be super nice. We can be super nice people with only the best of intentions.
Yeah.
But because we just can't see, right? We just can't see and we don't often trust what people of color are telling us about the place where we live and the structures and systems that we maintain. So.
One of the points that when you and I were prepping for this, one of the things, and I feel certain it came from you. So Sam, I'm gonna quote you and credit you, but I also want to say it out loud because I think it's important. One of the things that happens in verse 3 when the psalmist says, "Give light to my eyes," I think for a lot of us, our eyes, as you said, we are now sighted where we once were blind. And you said the shift here comes when we stop projecting our crisis onto God and we own it for ourselves.
I think that was mutually developed, but
Anyway,
it was the conversation that made it happen. So there you go. Yeah, you know, I think that I think in our initial panic and anxiety, panic attack over the brokenness, what feels like a brokenness in our relationship with God, we don't want to own it. And, you know, we blame God, but God is big enough to handle it. But there will hopefully come a moment when we turn and say, well, maybe it's what I can't see. And maybe I need your help, God, to see something bigger. Now, I will say that the psalmist talks about wanting to win a lot. Right?
Yeah.
Doesn't want their enemies to rejoice over them. Doesn't want, what is the language? Yes, my foes will rejoice because I'm shaken. Which led me to kind of wonder, I wonder if that's why God might be feeling absent, because I'm not sure that God's agenda is all about winning.
Yeah. Like, what is God winning here?
Or defeating, like, I'm not sure that God is like all about defeating our enemies, right? I think that's where, you know, we see in the person of Jesus Christ, you know, that God who doesn't accompany us in all of our more or less petty feelings of anger at people who disdain us or whatever. There's some other better way to say that. I'm trying to hook some Jesus in here, Mandy.
You're doing it. But it's just, it's that idea that like, every sports team that prays like, God, give us this victory, like the other sports team, God somehow up in heaven with the remote, like,
Yeah.
not the Dodgers again,
Right. So that, exactly. So that just like the umpire who's down there or the referee who's down there flipping a coin, to say who's going to receive the ball first or not,
Yeah.
that, that God is like, jump ball. Okay, you win.
All right, you guys. Yeah, but like doesn't the gospel, and not to skip ahead and certainly not to Christologize everything in the Hebrew Bible, that's not fair, but
No.
the idea that we get to this place where Jesus actually does say a lot about enemies and offensive things, mean, nasty things like love them and turn the other cheek. You haven't met my enemies, Jesus. They're terrible. I'm sure you don't mean that.
Like, if you have anything against your brother, leave your offering at the altar and then go and be reconciled to them. And then you mean you're telling me that I can't even authentically worship unless I fix it with my enemies? So that makes me wonder in this psalm whether God is feeling absent, because that's just not God's jam. That's not God's bag. Right.
Right.
So. Well, then there's this third movement, and it's the movement. I think sometimes we short circuit these first two of the prayer of complaint and then the prayer of supplication, and we kind of get here too quickly. But if we will go through these first two paths, right, through these first two doorways, then we can then enter into this room of praise, moving from plea to praise with a lot more appreciative and fuller voice.
It's this kind of like dings back on the idea of cheap grace, right? Like this psalm is only 6 verses.
Yeah, right.
And to go from how long will you hide your face to me to I will sing to the Lord because he's dealt bountifully with me. Like we have skipped over a lot of emotional trajectory here. And I find it, this is like, what are we, good vibes only now? Like I'm not satisfied that we had enough time, but it's because for whatever reason, the psalm was brief. And for whatever reason, it encapsulated the emotional arc that needed to be described, which is, complaint, plea, praise. Like that's it. That's enough. Those are all the things you have to do.
That's
and perhaps we get to this because the psalmist was honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's the other thing, that this is a hymn meant to be sung in temple worship.
Yeah.
Right. So when we read it, it is very brief, but you can only imagine that whatever tune the leader of music in the temple, like those first two verses have to be, how long, like it has to be any decent composer.
There's some melismas going on.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. We're both poor people too. So it's not going to be, how long is this going to last? Right. It's going to be drawn out. So there probably is sort of a feeling of that. So how can we replicate that? Well, I think by repetition, right? Like take the first two verses and read it out loud 3 or 4 or 5, 6 times in different ways with different tones of voice, right? And then take the next 2 verses and just let it, let the thing rise like bread, right? So that it's not a saltine, right? But it's something that can sustain, it can sustain us a bit longer. Right, so we arrive at this point of praise, and one of the things that I love about these last 2 verses is this sense of perspective, the verb tenses. And here's what, the psalmist says, I trusted, past tense, in your steadfast love, and so my heart shall rejoice in your salvation, right? Because I've trusted you in the past and have experienced salvation from you in the past, all right, I'm willing to be patient, knowing that my day of rejoicing is going to come. I know your deliverance is going to come. And I love that. I think one of the idols that we can turn to is nostalgia.
Oh, yes. Well said. I think that's really what tradition is, right?
Right. In other words,
Yeah.
right. Or let's say
Heritage
that
or
there's a healthy form of tradition and a pathological form of tradition,
yes.
right? That there's a kind of tradition that we use to avoid to avoid change,
Change.
right?
Yeah.
To avoid adaptation and growth, personal growth. Growth as a congregation, right?
Growth
There's
as
an
a country, right?
and
Growth
see,
as a
like,
country. Yeah.
yeah, your congregation has hundreds and scores of years that they could get stuck in if they wanted to, but they made certain choices along the way, were forced to, albeit, right?
Right.
And my congregation, and indeed every congregation I've ever served, has to deal with that temptation to go back to the time when you could just throw open a set of doors and people would stream in.
Yeah.
You didn't have to compete with anything else in the culture. So there's that sense of nostalgia. However, there is a healthy sense of tradition, a healthy sense of relating to the past.
Right.
And that is drawing on our experiences of grace that can provide us just enough hope that we believe we will not only experience that grace in the future, but we can actually become a source of it, right? For other people.
I like the verb tense shift here.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, we're both grammar nerds too, because I think that's very instructive and it's very telling. And
Yes.
in Hebrew poetry, especially, there's a lot that gets lost for us because we're reading an English translation, and the original language, which I am not particularly well versed in anymore, but it does lend itself much more to the poetic form. And
Yes.
so those words are carefully chosen. Those verb tenses are carefully
Mm-hmm.
chosen, not just because they rhyme, not just because they sound good. There's intention
And
behind the
connection.
poetry.
Right. Right.
And the idea, there's this wonderful James Baldwin quote. James Baldwin wrote, "The history is not past, it is the present. We carry our history with us." And this idea that the tension between the psalmist saying, "Because I trusted in your steadfast love, I will rejoice in your salvation and I will sing to the Lord." Like these things are not distinct, they're not separate. And in the sense that God lives in time in an eternal way that is different than our chronological way of thinking, this sort of unravels the entire experience of what it means to be in relationship with the eternal being. It's
Yes.
that, we're so limited. We are finite. We're on a time with calendars. God doesn't live that way. God does not exist that way. God can be past, present, future. Jesus can be crucified, died, and risen, and ascended, and yet present. God is different than us. And we are so finite in our capacity to both understand that. I mean, we just are, but
Yes.
also to give God grace to be God.
I mean, one of the most beautiful things that I ever think about when it comes to my relationship with God is knowing that in all of the broken relationships of my past and the relationships that I broke,
Mm-hmm.
that I believe with all my heart that God is back there working God's healing grace in the lives of all involved, right? We say that in a certain form, like time heals all wounds. God heals wounds, right? God heals wounds that have deep origins in the past, but that I just believe with all my heart that God is back in those moments, still continuing to clean out the muck and the pus and the goo that that collect, right? The detritus of our lives that prevent healing from happening, right?
Yeah.
Now, yeah. So that does make me stand, even in moments of lament and frustration and anger, needing a word from God, needing to see God's face, for me to say, oh yeah, maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you're back there. Maybe you're back there in the past. Maybe you're back there in the church's past. in the United Methodist Church's racist past,
Right.
right? Maybe you are back there, making making promise out of those moments where we screwed it up.
Well, and I think that that's the, if anything that we're learning right now, it's that words are futile unless they are paired with action. And the idea that if we understand our chronology as being just a finite capacity of humanity's existence in the world, then, one of the gut punch things that's really easy for me to say is, but I didn't do that. I didn't treat you that way.
Right.
I didn't. Yes, I did. Absolutely, I did. Because my history and my ancestors are 100% culpable and responsible. And if I have the audacity and the hubris to think that I don't benefit from that today, I am wrong. And I can't look away from my wrongness anymore. So my history is not past. My awareness of my place in time does not relieve me from the responsibility that I have now. That my past holds me accountable to how I live, not just in the present, but in the future.
Yeah. It's and part of that, and I know that this is the case for you, is that parenthood has changed a lot of things for me. Right. It's made more urgent the need for me to deal with my own recovering racism. And to lead God's people into a place where, just the mere fact that we have Black churches and white churches, like majority, just that ought to tell us something, right? It ought to tell us something. When we began our journey through this psalm, one of the things that we said was that lament is a language that is rooted in trust, not in doubt. And here in verse 5, we see that word explicitly stated, right? I trusted in your steadfast love, and therefore I will rejoice in your salvation. I love the fact that this process of lamentation, if we call the whole thing a lamentation process, mm-hmm. that it really does begin and end in trust and faith.
Yeah. And I think the conversation around grace is deeply wrapped up in that, because what we know to be true is that trust takes time to be earned. And the distinction there is that grace is freely given, which is why it's so terrifying. It's because we don't know how to truly trust things that are free.
Yeah, that we can control.
Yeah, and as Bonhoeffer mentions, free doesn't mean cheap. There's an important clarification there that God offers grace, and it comes at a very, very high price.
But the price is a loving. Yeah. It is a loving price, and I don't mean that in some kind of cheap or overly sentimentalized way, but that our relationship with God is rooted in a bond of love. And I think lamentation occurs when we experience that bond as being strained in some way. But God's command to us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength isn't just mere duty, but it is rooted in a relationship of delight that the psalmist remembers here. But it is hard in moments of despair, right, to remember that kind of delight.
I think maybe that's the message that comes through, and not to put everything in economic terms, but they speak clearly, and it's a common scriptural language. But that the grace that's experienced here by the psalmist, if we're talking about grace as being something that comes as a high cost, it's because it has value. And the value, of course, is in the relationship, right? Like that's what grace is. It's an explanation of an unconditional relationship.
Yes.
And the psalmist fears because the psalmist, like you and I, is a finite being who has experienced conditional relationships.
Sure.
Because people will tend to
will.
be close and far from each other, right? And so we don't trust that God can actually be a constant.
Mm.
And I think, you know, if the invitation is for grace to be received by us as a gift from God, it's because God values us so much. And the ask in return is mutual value.
I loved what you said a moment ago about that this relationship, like waking up or realizing or becoming, becoming aware of the constancy of grace, of God's relationship with us, whether we feel it or not, whether it seems to be this way or that way or not. And coming to trust that, I think that is an exercise in Christian maturity. Okay, so let's
perfection.
do what?
It's going on to perfection.
Going on to perfection. Good old Methodist perfection. So let me wrap up in this way. Let me see if I can make a summative statement of some kind. That what this psalm does for us, or what God offers us through the gift of the Word of God in this psalm, is the knowledge that we can be unvarnished in who we are before God. That in our difficulty in our relationship with God, that may be more about us than it is about God. And that there are some things perhaps we need to understand about ourselves, that we need light to the eyes so that we can see some things. But that praise of God really is born out of a long game with the divine. And it's not our game, right? It's God's long game with us, right? Nobody does this better than Methodists, right? Prevenient grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace, glorifying grace, 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 grace upon grace. But that each moment of difficulty and lament needs to be authentically experienced, but it also needs to be, we also need to be able to rise up, like we put our spiritual drone out a little bit so that we can see sort of the larger landscape of God, not in a cheap way, right? Not to just get past lament, but in order to put it in a larger sense of perspective. Does that help?
I think that's great.